the same time I met Linnea was the same time that I met you, Steve. And it was in the beginning, it was the first day of Gemini season, and I went up to Seattle to take for NORWAC to hear you speak.
Yeah.
And without, as a Gemini, without meeting both of you, right, I wouldn't be as fluent, or I wouldn't be as fluent as I am now in something, and because I've had people to learn from and talk to about the astrological worldview. It's, as a Gemini, it's given me so much energy, and it's added to the trajectory of my autobiographical life story in such a powerful, meaningful way.
Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of the Lila Astrology podcast. My name is Linnea Miron, and I am the host of today's episode. And we are in Gemini season 2024. And we're going to start off by focusing on the ruler of the season to give everyone a feel of it. And that is the planet Mercury, which is a planet I love very much. And so to talk about this planet today, we are going to have two people. The first one is Steven Forrest. He is the renowned evolutionary astrologer that many of you already know. And he wrote, among many other books, one called The Book of Air, which is a fantastic book. If you want to check it out, it really shows his expertise on the planet Mercury, sign of Gemini, sign of Virgo, and all the other air clans. So we're going to be talking about that later today. I have a couple questions for him from parts of that book that I really loved. And then the second guest is our one and only Ricky Williams. He is our Gemini extraordinaire, and this is his birthday season. And we're going to jump in with these two to talk about Mercury. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Hey.
Okay. So, Ricky, one of your stated intentions of this podcast when we talked about it, we didn't do a lot of planning for this one, Mercury style, but one of them was, let's at least set an intention so we know what we're hoping to accomplish in this time together with Steve. And you mentioned that you wanted to give everyone a sense, anyone who's listened to this, that they can walk away feeling like they have a sense of what it's like to be in a Mercury time. So what does that mean? Because everybody goes through Mercury times, right? And since we're in Gemini season, and the ruler is Mercury, we are effectively in a universal Mercury time, and we will be again in Virgo season. So we'll mention this again later this year. But for now, we're in Gemini season, and let's give people a feel going into these 30 days of how to recognize when Mercury is that planet at the forefront that you're doing the dance with, and to say who's here and what are the lessons to be gleaned from this. So, Ricky, where do you start with your astrology clients when they ask you, when they're in a Mercury time and you're giving them a feel for how to recognize it and how to optimize it?
Yeah, good question. No, I'll frame this as I think, as a Gemini, when someone is spending a lot of time with me, they're in a Mercury time. Okay. And when they're with me, I say, what impact do I really desire to have on people, and that they learn something. Okay. And so I think a Mercury time is the universe is trying to tell us something, new information coming in. And I suggest to them, keep an open mind, keep an eye out for signs, omens, synchronicities, because the universe is trying to show you something. And so when I'm talking to someone, I realize people that don't have an open mind, or people who are not open to new perspectives, or people who don't want to learn, right? It doesn't go well. I don't feel seen. I don't feel heard. I don't feel like I've offered anything. And more importantly, I'm bored. I'm bored.
I'm appreciating, Linnea, you mentioned my book, The Book of Air, and it includes a lot about Mercury, as you say. The reason it comes to mind is the subtitle of the Book of Air is The Art of Paying Attention. And that's the essence of Mercury and really Gemini. among the pop astrologers, the associations with Mercury and Gemini are about, well, communication, which is an accurate word, but the kind of cliche is you can always recognize the Gemini because he's the person or she's the person with their mouth open. It's sort of a way of making fun of Gemini. That's the chatterbox. It talks too much. When Gemini gets dysfunctional, it can be that way. It's a nervous, high-pitched energy. It can come out as chatter, but that just eclipses the real point. And the real point is learning. It's like when we're talking, we're saying what we already know. When we're listening, we're maybe learning something we don't know yet. And that sense of keeping our eyes open for what we haven't yet seen is the critical point. Ricky mentions keeping an eye out for signs and omens, and that's a huge part of Mercury, almost forgotten in our modern culture. But Mercury, it's like the way the universe will. Well, like you have lunch with a friend, and your friend mentions a book that you should read, and you kind of barely register it. People do that all the time. And then 2 days later, another friend mentions the same book. And then 3 days later, you happen to be at a bookstore and the clouds part and a ray of sunshine lands on a book on the opposite shelf. And you walk over there and it's that book. And it's like, okay, God, I'll buy the book. And I'm having fun talking like this. But the point is, universally, in everybody's experience, there are patterns like this. We sort of laugh and dismiss them, treat them playfully, but it's actually one of the basic laws of the universe. It's synchronicity. The universe is constantly guiding us with signs and omens, and a Mercury art is learning to recognize those patterns, to expect them during a Mercury time, be alert to them, look for them, and honor them. Follow them where they lead you. You'll become a wiser person. You go to bed that night smarter than you were when you got out of bed that morning, and that's really the point.
Yeah. So I think about being intentional in a Mercury time. And I've noticed for me, a Mercury time, it's most useful when I find something that I would like to learn more about.
Yeah.
So a few years ago, we were building Lila, and I was realizing the development team, they don't speak astrology, and I don't speak code. So there are so many miscommunications,
Yeah.
And I thought, if I could speak a little bit of code, I feel like I could communicate more easily with the development team. And so I went on YouTube and I, took a couple of classes. And after 2 days, I realized this is awesome. And it's become one of my greatest hobbies. And I had the mental energy to watch the YouTube videos and to practice and to do the studying, and it caught on.
Yeah.
And it was literally learning a new language. Because I've always been envious of people who speak multiple languages, because it allows them different perspectives, different ways to process reality.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've heard you say when you talk about Mercury, it's so beautiful, is creating a mental framework or a mental way to process what we see out in the world. Is that there's what is there and there's how we perceive it.
Yeah. Beautiful. It's like I always think of 3 layers when I'm thinking of Mercury, and the top layer, not necessarily the best, but the most obvious, is speech. But we can't speak unless we think, and so thinking, all the words that we don't say, that are in our heads, that's Mercury too. And then thought rests on the foundation of perception. If we saw nothing to think about, nothing to say. And so perception is the heart of it. Perception is the root with Mercury. And then the notion is that the less you expect something, the more interesting it is. the more valuable it is, the more likely it is to be teaching you something. And that leads me to, I guess, a bumper sticker, basically, for thinking about Mercury, but it's a good one. It's better to be curious than to be right.
Mm.
That's a
Wow.
good one.
Yeah.
That's a good one. So in Lila, in the My Profile section, we call Mercury, we talked about how do we sum up each of these planets in a couple of words, right? And we're always talking about that and how to tweak that. We call Mercury finding your true voice, or that's how we orient our community towards the purpose of Mercury for them.
Yes.
And showing them how to find their true voice through understanding the sign placement and the house placement and the aspects and so forth. In Book of Air, you talk about this, about finding your true voice, and you use this great example of Martin Luther King Jr. and his Mercury in Aquarius in the 10th house.
Yeah.
And what I love about your teaching style is you have these historical figures that you remind us of, all the ones we learned in school, but you explain part of their impact on the world in a way where someone can say, oh, I see how he did that, right? And you talk about how he locked in to the nature of that Mercury in Aquarius.
Yeah.
And when we do that and we do it authentically, not only do people listen and we're heard, but they take us seriously.
Yeah.
And he's a great example of that with the dream speech. And so I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about that and go into a little more detail of why you chose him and how that translates into how we talk about Mercury in the Lila app.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. It's one of my favorite topics, actually. So the key here is, and thinking of the Reverend Martin Luther King, his Mercury in Aquarius, as you say, and Aquarius is a sign that is oriented to the future. It's Aquarian energy. People who carry a lot of Aquarian energy today are where the culture is going to be in 10 years or 50 years. It's like they're all futurists. And so Martin Luther King famously had a dream, and everybody knows that incredible speech, and it's a speech about a tomorrow that didn't exist when he was giving the speech, and so we have a lot going on there. It's first his perceptions and his thoughts, his Mercury, were naturally oriented in an Aquarian way. He had a natural intellectual instinct to think about tomorrow and the processes that might bring us there. If his Mercury were in Capricorn, he might be thinking about yesterday and how we got to where we are today. If his Mercury were in Cancer, he might be thinking in terms of people's hurts and how to heal them. If his Mercury were in Scorpio, he might be thinking dark thoughts about what nobody is willing to talk about. Each Mercury has its own style based on the sign that it's in. And the notion is that once we understand what sign our Mercury is in, we are able to tune into the perceptions we're supposed to have, which give us the thoughts we're supposed to have, which support us discovering the voice we're supposed to have. And when you have the voice you're supposed to have, everybody listens. They sense here is somebody who is saying what needs to be said. They're doing their dharma, they're on their path, and we become incredibly powerful. People listen to us. That's simply how it works. Martin Luther King, that was up in the 10th house, and that's the world, the mission, the career. So obviously, his Aquarian voice was very public. Somebody else's might be in a different house where it's all about intimacy, like it's in the 7th house or the 8th house, and you're learning to find how to express yourself, to find your voice in terms of the people you kind of count on one hand. in your life. So each one has a different style and a different purpose.
So I want to connect this back to what the kind of the theme that we started with is a Mercury time. So I imagine, well, we know, right, leading up until the speech that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had gone through many Mercury times,
Yeah.
you know? And so I think of someone with Mercury and Aquarius, there's going to be specific kinds of books that are mentioned to us or that synchronicity show up in our life that activate, because part of listening is reading, right? When you're reading something, you're listening to other people's thoughts, other people's perspectives. And I imagine, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. going through a Mercury time, and he's being exposed to outside of the box, futuristic, unconventional thoughts.
Yes.
And ideas. Yeah. And so drawing the connection that because we each have a different Mercury, that Mercury times, they'll have that same feel to them, but they'll be more specific to developing our individual Mercuries.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. I'm thinking, it's not a contradiction, just another way of saying what you just said. So Martin Luther King in a Mercury time, he's flooded with all the same information the rest of us are flooded with. He's watching the news, he's reading a newspaper and all this, but his Mercury in Aquarius perceives kind of with deeper focus and interest information that's of an Aquarian nature, that other people might not notice. But he says, oh, there's the seed of tomorrow in this sentence I'm hearing now or reading now. And he notices it. And then there's another seed of tomorrow 2 days later, and he puts them together, because his Mercury is in Aquarius. So he's selectively observing reality. Whereas somebody else, I get Mercury in Scorpio, which is more psychological, suspicious. It's like, there's a lie. I smell a lie in this line. 2 days later, oh, there's another lie. Wait a minute, there's a conspiracy.
Yes.
And yeah, there it is. The perceptual style that leads us to finding our true voice.
Yeah, I'm hearing the way we connect the dots, and we can only connect the dots that we are most aware of.
Yes. Yes.
And the idea of like Mercury and learning, right? That if we're talking to someone or we're in a class and we don't have much interest in the person or the content being shared, it becomes difficult to learn.
Yes.
And so I think in a Mercury time, I tend to surround myself with things that mentally stimulate me so that I can make the most of the activity of the mind. And I also find if I'm not doing that in a Mercury time, that I tend to notice more worry. It's like the mind is revved up, but there's no new information. So it just keeps going, reviewing the old information.
Exactly. That leads directly to insomnia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an innocent error somebody of a philosophical nature could make here. Talking about, like, we all have kind of Mercury blinders on. We're interested in different things, not interested in that, interested in this. The mistake somebody could make is that, wouldn't it be great if you were just open to everything? If your mind were completely open. But what would happen if that were true? I think of somebody who's just taken a really heavy dose of some psychedelic medicine, and they're just like, awestruck, overwhelmed, flooded with perception. And so there's something really beautiful here, that the universe gave you the Mercury that you have because it's the right Mercury for you. It's as if God is saying to you, here's something I want you to pay attention to. You don't need to pay attention to the rest. You don't need to learn coding, or you don't need to learn how to work on your car, or you don't need to learn the history of the Roman Empire. What you need to learn is Jungian psychology and astrology. I mean, everybody would have a different mix, but it's like the universe is guiding us to what it most benefits us to study and to learn about. We trust our natural instincts, and they lead us in the right direction. It's beautiful.
And that feels so relevant in today because we are so much information available to us.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we weed through and find the things that are relevant and meaningful to us?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We'll hold the entire knowledge of humanity in our pockets with our cell phones, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I watch
So
cat videos
cat video.
that I've learned a lot from my cats, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Um, so Steve, you would be considered going through a Mercury time right now if transiting Pluto's going over your natal Mercury, right? Your natal Mercury is in Capricorn at the end of Capricorn,
And
in the very end in the third house.
that's
Um,
correct.
and if so Pluto, so somebody with transiting Pluto going over their Mercury would be in a Mercury time. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that would be an illustration of it.
Okay. So similarly, I noticed that I have progressed Mercury in my third house,
Uh-huh.
opposing my natal Pluto in the ninth.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you're also a ninth house natal Pluto. And
We
I
should
thought,
form a support group.
exactly, exactly. So I thought, okay, there, different configurations, but enough similar that I would say that that's an interesting overlay that you and I are having at the same time, current sky. Um, whereas we have different Mercury placements natally, but now there's sort of this lining up in the third house, ninth house. And so for me, I'm thinking, okay, that seems to indicate you were just going through some different examples of different houses and different sign placements. This would seem to me there's a real strong indication of education
Yeah.
for both of us in that ninth house, third house positioning.
Mhm.
And with Pluto there, I'm also wondering, and by the way, that progressed Mercury of mine is going to be sort of hanging out opposite that Pluto for quite a while.
Probably
Um,
been there for a while too, hasn't it?
yeah, it went over it and then went retrograde back slowly, and now it's sort of just, I think it's stationing or something. I think Ricky had told me that that was going to be a major um, configuration for much of the rest of my life, for me to be aware of that Mercury Pluto in the backdrop as other things are happening. And so when I saw that you're going through a transiting one, I thought, oh, that's interesting, in the same place. So thinking about how we can be aware of that for each other, and also how we can maximize that, right? As people that work together going through something similar. I
Mhm.
always like to do that.
Yeah. It's astrology always works, of course, and a really obvious observation here is you and I both in major Mercury times, and of course we were both deeply involved in creating the Lila app, which is words and communication. What is the nature of the words and the communication in Lila? Plutonian stuff. It's deep, it's psychological. I'm smiling, you're smiling. It's obvious. We already knew it, but it is an illustration of how the events in our charts reflect the events in our lives. You know, it never fails. Now, there will be some deeper implications, you know, for both of us here. Uh, there's you mix Pluto and Mercury, and the information that is surfacing is information that tends to have a psychological charge on it. The idea is we're ready to look at things that we were not really emotionally prepared to look at, let's say 2 or 3 years ago. That we've come to a point where it's appropriate to say, I guess that's true. I don't like it, but I guess it's true. Uncomfortable information. The evolutionary challenge in a Mercury Pluto time is to avoid a reflex of rationalization and defensiveness, you know, creating a shell of words that prevent us from actually learning what we need to learn because it's psychologically threatening. That's what the garbage can looks like. The higher ground is being honest with yourself.
I
Yeah,
can't
can
help but sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No,
Oh,
I can't help. Sorry, go ahead, ladies first.
no, you go. No, it's your turn. But I'm gonna, but I'm gonna, it's such a gem. No, me, no. Um, No, I'm going to come back to that Pluto going over. I want to come back to a garbage can example that I want to ask Steve about.
Okay, go for it, because mine can wait. Yeah.
Okay. So Steve, that garbage can example that you gave, as I'm listening to you talk about this Mercury going over, Pluto going over Mercury, I'm reminded of how we did on Lila's Instagram. We do those celebrity spotlights of when they're going through big times in their life and what would Lila have said to them using the time scroll. And you and I worked on one last year where we featured Lance Armstrong. And Lance Armstrong had Pluto transiting over his Mercury when he came clean to Oprah on television after all those years of saying the opposite of what he said in that interview in terms of the doping, so to speak, that everyone called it. And so he revealed emotionally charged information, uncomfortable information. But to me, it's like, okay, that's an example. That's a cautionary tale. I would say perhaps maybe you can speak to this when we talk about Pluto, how Pluto can you speak to how Pluto can be connected to lies? Similar to how the Scorpio is suspicious of lies, Pluto, the planetary ruler, how in a Pluto Mercury time, one of the expressions we could see if you're living a life where that exists, that could be a time when something like that has to come to the surface. And I'm sure that was probably the most charged moment of his life,
Yes.
right? That Pluto going over that Mercury because of how he had lived leading up to that point and how it had to be expressed.
Yes. I would I guess my first reaction is just a namaste to Lance Armstrong, that he didn't have to tell the truth, he could have chosen to continue the lie. An evolutionary astrologer would have suggested to him, this is a time for truth, trust me, you'll be better off. That would be the message. A fortune-telling astrologer, one of the deterministic, mechanistic ones, often view Pluto very negatively and might say you're going to be in a world of lies, somebody will be lying to you, and fill him with fear and negativity about it. And that could be true too, It's like that's where Lila is so different from many of the other forms. We don't feel that we can see the future, but we see the questions, we see the potentials, and we can see the right path, and we can warn you about the wrong path. I don't want to oversimplify. Lila's not dogmatic like that, but in a Pluto Mercury time, it's truth time. Trust me, you're going to be better off if you tell the truth, but you're going to be tempted not to because it's going to hurt to tell the truth. It's going to hurt you. It might even hurt other people for you to tell the truth. Do it anyway. It's like this is Lila as your wise best friend who reads the Riot Act to you. This is Lila as your counselor, as your guru. Not the dictator that controls your life. That's a wrong model. That's old-fashioned astrology, and it doesn't work very well.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the three layered cake. That speaking, right, and then thinking, and then perception.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we've been talking about is really the core of that bottom level, but the other levels exist too. And so, I think of Mercury times. I think of times where we need clarity, okay, and so things are showing up that help us provide more clarity. But it's like I say Mercury times where it's time to say what you see. Again, activating all three layers. And so someone needs more clarity, but a lie they're holding on to is keeping the clarity from coming in. So giving voice to it, right, allows new information to come in that you couldn't have had access to if you were still holding on to the psychological material.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I think of you and Linnea going through Pluto, Mercury activations, 3rd house, 9th house. And during this time, we specifically you and Linnea started the Lila Astrology podcast. And and I know specifically from Linnea's perspective, right? All of this studying, thinking, perceiving, okay, but not so much sharing and talking about it. And she's doing a wonderful job. And even, going through and rereading the Book of Air, right? Taking in this information, getting a little bit deeper, and then being able to sit with the master and have a conversation at that level. It's cool.
Yeah,
Really
it is
cool.
cool. It is cool.
Yeah.
Just jamming off that free associatively, which is how Mercury works. I'm thinking up at the top layer of our layer cake, communication. There's a classic Mercury phenomenon where you're just yakking with a friend, and something comes out of your mouth, and it's like, oh my God, that's true, isn't it? I, I I didn't know I knew that. I never thought of it like that before. The way conversation, especially engaged, excited conversation, which has that Mercury flavor, the way it's creative and it creates perceptions, that trigger thoughts and, lead to more conversation. It's a fascinating system.
We know this episode is so good. We wanted to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. If you like what you hear so far, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode with a friend too. Did you know we have a merch line? That's right. You can find hoodies, mugs, phone case covers, hats, and more on our shop page. So if you're enjoying the podcast and want to support us, head on over to our shop page down below and check out all of the cool merch we have for each season. Now, let's get back to the show.
When I'm talking to someone who has a lot of Mercury or third house configurations in their chart, and I go back to the idea of finding your voice, and let's say Mercury is conjunct Mars, I might say if you have any friends who are police officers, firemen who kind of speak more in a Marsy type of way, that if you're having a conversation with them, very often they'll say something and the response is, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
And for me, that moment of I never thought about it that way, to me, I interpret that as someone has said something and the words they used to describe it were more accurate than the words that we had before. And so we are actually finding ways to express ideas through interaction with people who are expressing those ideas.
Exactly. And we've got to learn to listen to their words and use them. It reminds me of a counseling situation I was in years and years ago in my practice. A woman, a very judgmental father. She grew up kind of hard. Her father was rough on her. And I remember just kind of feeding back to her and saying, well, your father thought you were bad. I think those were my words. It was pretty much just echoing what you seemed to be saying. And she said, no, my father thought I wasn't good enough. And it's a pretty subtle distinction, but it was important to her. And from that moment on, that's how I said it. That's how she needed to hear it. And in this case, I serve as a good example. Sometimes I don't, but listening carefully to the linguistic structures that another person is using, and then entering their linguistic structure rather than projecting your linguistic structure onto them, you build that bridge of Mercury connection.
So part of Lila, the part that I'm really excited about is the connection section. And there's books, and you hear a lot of people talk about their love language, and I always think 5 love languages. Started studying astrology, it was like there's 12. There's 12 love languages. And the way you're talking about it, communication is so important in relationships. And the idea is what I would add to what you just said. If you would like to be heard by the person, listen to the way they think and the way information comes in, and you put yourself in a position where it's more easy to be heard by them. I think, moving into relationship, right? Linnea's Mercury, powerful Mercury in Pisces, directly to the degree opposing my ascendant. And if I'm being too critical, okay, too mental, right? Linnea, I can tell it creates a disconnect in our ability to communicate. And I can feel it. I can feel the words that are coming out of my mouth. They're not going in. They're just bouncing off. And it's a reminder for me to shift more into, okay, how would Mercury and Pisces, be able to hear this more easily?
Yeah.
And sometimes we're having a difficult time communicating. I'll bring up some synchronicity, and I tune Linnea's mind to the synchronicity, and it's like it turns into this beautiful conversation of us making connections together.
Yeah. Yes. It's
showing me the bigger picture.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I love what Ricky said, and I would add to it that sometimes Ricky benefits Linnea's Piscean Mercury by confronting it with perspectives and information that it wouldn't naturally see. Again, this brings us right to the heart of Mercury, that it's about learning what we don't already know. Better to be curious than to be right. And so Ricky puts a certain stress on Linnea's Mercury, and Linnea returns the favor, I am sure. And that's good for both of you, that tension, that stretching of each other's Mercuries. It's not always comfortable. Every form of miscommunication arises out of it, but it also kind of feeds the Mercury by compelling it to stretch a little further.
And just piggybacking here, sorry, go ahead.
How do we take our two Mercuries that you just looked at, and do we then bring in our third house planets as well into consideration, or do we just sort of stay with the two Mercuries? Like, do we take in that he's got a Neptune in the third house and I have a Venus in the third house?
Yeah.
Where does the third house come in with that analysis?
It's part and parcel of it. The basic, absolutely basic astrological insight here is that for every astrological idea, or every idea that we would say in plain English, there are three astrological symbols that describe it. There is a planet, there is a sign, and there is a house. There are different nuances of the same idea. It's kind of like, pretty, beautiful, and lovely, They don't exactly mean the same thing, but obviously they're in the same family. And so we have Mercury, Gemini, the third house as one of these triads. We could bring in Virgo in the sixth house as well. That'll brings up a different perspective. But the Gemini third house Mercury, these are the symbols of language, of listening and speaking, thinking, perceiving, all of this. And so to get a full profile of a person's communication style and their path to their true voice, you need to look for their Mercury, its sign and house. You need to see if there is a planet in the third house, and you need to see if there is a planet in Gemini. The latter two conditions might not exist, but if they do exist, they're part of it. They become part of the perceptual style.
And all of that information that he just listed out, Ricky, is in the My Profile section, right?
It's in the My Profile section. Yeah.
So anyone on the My Profile, Lila, could track what Steve was saying and go and identify those placements.
Yeah, and I think
and see what we say about them to give them some guidance. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I imagine a couple that's going through communication issues, I think it could benefit them to sit down and see, are there any, where's the Mercury? Are there any planets in the third house? What are the aspects to Mercury? And even if you don't know astrology, right? Lila is written in plain English, so you'll get a better sense of how to improve the communication to your partner, and also how to ask and to give your partner information about how they can communicate better with you. And I think it's a fruitful conversation, because I'm a Gemini, but the thing that I appreciate the most about my relationship with Linnea is that I've gotten so much smarter through this relationship. Is that as we're speaking, right, we're speaking at least close enough to the same language that we can keep going back and forth, new perspectives, new ideas, new ways to look at things. it's been very beneficial.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like our home is like an education center where we're just constantly we're self-educating, but we're each other's like partners in learning. Like if I didn't live with someone who was also interested in learning every day, I wouldn't do it as much. You know, it's just like having a workout partner or something like that. So it's just that's definitely the glue in our relationship for sure.
Beautiful. And you sound like somebody with the Venus in the third house there. Your love situation linked to third house learning, teaching, conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. And the first time we met, and I wasn't hitting on her. It's just she seemed interesting, and I was curious, like, what's going on? Like, what's her sun sign? And so I said, what's your sun sign? And she said, I don't know. She said, I don't know, but I'm a Pisces. And I said, that's your sun sign. And I said, the mystic, straight from inner sky, the archetypes, the mystic, you know. And she stopped and she looked at me and she said, I'm a corporate attorney, you know. But the nature of the conversation in that first interaction was I could talk about astrology and the out there stuff that I was interested in. And I could tell she eyes locked, nodding her head, that she was picking up what I was laying down. And I noticed over the next few months in conversation that it wasn't me say something and then the room gets quiet and stops as people ponder what I'm saying, but she was actually able to take it in and to create a response back to me. And it was almost shocking because I wasn't accustomed to it. Yeah. And I say the process of me getting smarter in this relationship is because the nature of the conversations were about things that we were both interested in. And the same time I met Linnea was the same time that I met you, Steve. And it was in the beginning, it was the first day of Gemini season, and I went up to Seattle to take for NORWAC to hear you speak.
Yeah.
And without, as a Gemini, without meeting both of you, right, I wouldn't be as fluent, or I wouldn't be as fluent as I am now in something, And because I've had people to learn from and talk to about the astrological worldview, it's, as a Gemini, it's given me so much energy, and it's added to the trajectory of my autobiographical life story in such a powerful, meaningful way.
Beautiful, eloquent.
Yeah.
It's making me think of, I think this was the first time I met you, Linnea, and it was up there in Calistoga. I was teaching a class, and with my apprenticeship program, Ricky asked for a special dispensation that his girlfriend could sit in, for a little while. And this may be projection on my part, but you walked in, and I had the feeling you were there because your boyfriend wanted you to be there. I'm not sure if that was true. You were polite and everything, but the corporate attorney persona was still pretty strong with you in those days. And I happened to be teaching about Venus. And I remember you're sitting in the back with Ricky. There's like 50 people, I guess, in the room, and I remember just keeping an eye on you and watching you. Like at first and then you were pulled in, and you were going to stay there for a couple of hours. I think you were there the rest of the time, and it was fabulous. And I mean, it's just a happy personal memory. But I'm also saying it because I was speaking about Venus. I was speaking about relationship. Your third house of things you're naturally curious about has Venus in it. And so your curiosity was piqued. You became engaged because what I was saying was sort of perfectly aligned with what God wanted you to study in this lifetime, with your own Venus in the third house. So it was just a wonderful example of synchronicity, a wonderful example of what historically at least was called the hand of God, kind of moving us all together in the perfect way, because the universe came into existence so Lila could be created, among other things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well said.
exactly. I mean, that day you were going through Venus and the different signs. And I remember, I think you had started with Venus and Aries, and I didn't come to that class. And I think Ricky was on a lunch break. I picked him up for a lunch break, or then at the end of the night. And he was like, Steve's going to get to Venus in Pisces like tomorrow, which is yours. So, why don't we see if because we didn't want to take advantage. That was the other thing. I was a little uneasy because I thought, oh, everybody sees me coming in here and I'm not part of the whole class, and just not wanting to feel like I was just there to get a free class from you and then take off, right? So we said, okay, she's only going to sit in for the segment where you cover her Venus, right? So we kept it to I was only there for like 2 hours or something. But yeah, I remember at first being like, okay, what's he talking about? What's he talking about? And I think you maybe were in Capricorn and then Venus in Aquarius, and you got to Venus in Pisces. And that's when I was just like, yeah. And so it's just that Ricky is able to think of those magical little things too. He does this all the time where he comes up with an idea of, let's go to this place at this time for this thing. And then it sets off a whole, the rest is history kind of thing. So yeah, I remember that very well. I'd love to go back and find the date of that class so we can kind of see what was going on in our charts when these
I'd be
different,
curious.
yeah. And especially what was going on in Ricky's life when he met both of us around the same time.
Yeah.
2015. Yeah, 9 years ago.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
2015.
Yeah. So Steve, I think my favorite quote, or one of my favorite quotes from the Mercury section, the Gemini section of the Book of Air, is the one that you quote, that when the pickpocket meets the saint, he sees pockets. And it's so simple, and yet I feel like I'm still unpacking it a little bit, still trying to understand the depth of the wisdom in those few words. Can you just talk about that a little bit, why you chose that for that section of the book?
It's my favorite third house proverb. I got it from Ram Dass, a book called The Miracle of Love. It's a book about his guru named Karoli Baba in India. I think it's like a Hindu saying or a Hindu proverb. When the pickpocket meets the saint, he sees pockets. That we all see the world according to our interests, our attachments, our fears. Nobody can see the world as it is. We see through the eyes of our own character and our own nature. And I guess I repeat myself here a little bit. It would be a big mistake to think that's a problem. Like we should be wide open to everything all the time. A compelling idea, but it's not realistic. There's just too much out there. And so trusting the benign universe, your chart is perfect. Your chart is a gift from a loving, conscious universe to you because it helps guide you in the right direction. And your third house energies, Mercury, Gemini energies, it's the universe saying, here's what you need to pay attention to. In this lifetime, it's your dharma to be a pickpocket. So check out pockets. That obviously makes us laugh. It's probably not too good for anybody to be a pickpocket, obviously, but maybe some soul needs to go through that. And so check out pockets. And so each of us, we're guided to pay attention to the educational path in the broadest sense of that word, where we get the most bang for the buck. You get the best use of your minutes in this world, learning what you need to learn. It's a beautiful thing. And then a side effect, if you do that, the perceptions feed the thoughts that make your voice very powerful. So people want to hear you, and you benefit people from what you say to them because you're on the right wavelength. And so that's good for the ego. And I don't want to be too hard on the ego. It's good to feel that you're on the right track and you're helping people and you have something important to say and people appreciate what you have to say. I'd never shame anybody for enjoying that. That's good. It's good for you. It's good for everybody else. And that's the fruit of trusting your Mercury.
Mm. Any last words on that, Mr. Gemini? When we were little, we used to pick pockets. I'm thinking about that now. I'm like, well, I went through a phase where I stole, and so did Ricky, where I was on a sailboat with my dad's friends, and I'm sure among them they are total saints, but when I went down underneath to go to the bathroom, all I saw were purses. And I was like, And I took a little bit out of each purse. It was like, no one's going to notice. Right. But but these are wonderful people. Like then I got a little older and I'm like, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe, but at the time that's all I perceived. Right. I got a second house son. I like to make money.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I'd add to what Steven said is, as a Gemini, and I didn't realize it until later in life. As a football player, people were not that concerned with what I had to say, especially if it wasn't about football. And so when I left football and I started traveling around the world, I remember this specific conversation. I was at a campground in Byron Bay, Australia. And I was talking to this British guy, and he had given me a book to read on Ayurveda. And I had no idea what Ayurveda was, but it was interesting, kind of one of those synchronistic events and I went through the book, and it was a whole new perspective based on common sense, right? The Ayurvedic point of view, it was, with Steven, sometimes what you'll say with Taurus, where my Mercury is, right? And eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired. And as I started reading this book on Ayurveda, it was talking about eating according to the seasons. This basic earthly common sense that they had a whole medical system based off of it. Yeah. So I was reading this book and I was like, wow. And so I started having a conversation with this young man about the book. And I remember still to this day, he said, wow, I never thought about it that way. That was his response to me. And I didn't know what to say because I wasn't used to people appreciating my unique perspective. But something in me caught a fire, right? And from my birth to that day at 27 years old, I had read 3 books front to back. The next 3 months, I had read 20 books front to back. No, it was an awakening, powerful Mercury Gemini awakening for me, and it led to this point where people are paying me for my perspective.
Yes.
Oh, wow. And so it has bolstered my sun and Gemini, my ego, right? That I'm saying things that are useful and meaningful to people, right? That words are coming out of my mouth and people are learning something from them. And it feels great.
Taurus words too. I love, let me jump in there that Taurus, when we use the word simple in connection with a person's mind, it's generally read as an insult, like he's a simple-minded person. But we have to liberate ourselves from that attitude to understand Taurus. Taurus is the wisdom of simplicity. Like, let's eat according to the seasons. Let's what the earth is producing now, let's eat that. Maybe the universe is telling us something important here. And it's like we live in a world, like you were saying a little while ago, Rick, about all just the density of information, all the unnecessary information, all the complexity that is not necessary, that in fact stands between us and knowing what's really important, and the Taurus capacity to cut through the complexity, to cut through the noise, to get to the simple heart of the matter, to get to the essence of things. And as you do that, you speak with great authority, like you're saying to people who've never heard of astrology or have nothing but a misunderstanding of it. You're saying, we are affected by the sky. It's like, look up. You're not affected by that. It's like, oh, duh, but the heart of the matter, and when you speak in those kind of insightfully simple ways that cut to the heart of things, cut to the root of things, you're close to your true voice, and people listen. Yeah. It's beautiful.
The last thing I'll say is, so I went through a phase a couple of years ago where I started writing poetry. Poetry. It was like, I felt like it was the only way that I could really express myself. And it was an amazing time because the words were just coming out and it was beautiful. But when I went back to read the poetry, they were like nursery rhymes. I use very simple words that a 7-year-old could understand, but how profound what I was saying in the words, it was beautiful. And at first I was self-conscious because I was like, I'm using simple words, but when I saw the whole poem and what it said, it helped me find my voice, that process of writing that way, and appreciate my voice.
Yeah, beautiful. Poetry forces us to get to the essence of things. Taurus work.
Yeah, and the lyrics of songs, if you look at them on paper without listening to the music, they're super simple, right? So they're but powerful. Yeah. Well, that's great to close on that for this one. So, Steve, Ricky, thank you so much for another enlightening conversation. At the beginning of Gemini season, we're going to pick this conversation back up later, but this is a good start talking about Mercury. I hope we've given everyone a sense of what this season's going to feel like. And till next one, thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.